Okay, I'm going to jump in and talk about what I'm doing at the moment. I don't know if you've seen me, I'm kind of pouring over this torso fill at the moment. So I've found a gap on the torso, large gap on the torso, and I'm trying to get the rigid fill working. Now, in an instance like this, where there's a lot of markers missing, it can be quite confusing to try and see what's what in the viewport. So I'm just watching very, very carefully and seeing how it looks before. So as Faisal crosses his arms over in front of himself when he crouches down. Now, what that does to a mocap suit when someone does that is makes it go all loose and baggy. We deliberately put a tight suit on someone, but certain positions, no amount of tightness in a suit is going to stop that. So as you cross your arms in front of you, it's going to make the material slightly loose on the front of the suit, which is causing me a bit of an issue. So when I try and fill the gaps on this, I'm not getting the nice steady fill that I would want, or the nice kind of rigid fill that I would want, because there's deformation in the body. So this is what I'm looking at the moment, is I'm trying to kind of scrub through and see what the results are when I do this rigid film. So if you watch now, so as I go, the first marker goes missing, which is the clavicle. So whilst that's missing, if I press the W key, it does a rigid fill. And there's a bit of movement. See that movement? And that's because during the time frame of that happening before it comes back, that marker's kind of moved a little bit from where it should be. It's not had a completely rigid relationship with the others. So we've got a bit of a drift on it. So what I would need to do in this instance is to just be careful. I can't just assume that that works. What I would want to do is to check the solve to make sure that that's okay. And as I said last week, we can check the solves as we go. So that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to fill that gap, and then I'm going to do a solve to see if that skeleton fixes, because you can see the skeleton in the background is going a bit janky, yeah, because it's unstable. There's too few markers around. So I'm just going to fill that other gap as well there on the bottom one. And as you can see, there's a little bit of movement in there, but I want to make sure that it doesn't affect the solve or make it look too bad in the solve. It's a very closed stance. So what we'll be looking for there is anything that makes that stance move uncontrollably, which would say, no, that's a bad idea. Let's find another way around it. Now you just saw there that this sort of solve creeps it in. There's still noise around it because the other markers are missing. But as it moves, that drift, it's not too bad because he slightly turns his body. So even though that's not a perfect rigid fill, it's not affecting the skeleton in enough of a way. Now, what I will do is continue to clean around that. So what you can do at a point like this is you could change and start cleaning the shoulder markers to try and get all of the data clean around that area, or you can just keep going and come back to it later on. There's a little bit of drift there, but as you can see, it's kind of as Faisal's adjusting his shoulder positions and he uses that move. So at the moment, if that gets handed off to animation, I don't think anyone's going to really notice it because it's quite complex stance and pose, and there's lots of wobbles around on the shoulders as well. So I would want to kind of note that in my notebook and come back to it later effectively. It's not perfect because there's drift, but it's also not completely breaking that animation and making it unreadable. And that's ultimately the goal. The best rule in visual effects and computer generated work is if it looks right, it is right. And if it's not broke, don't fix it. Save yourself work. If it works, it works. And that's the kind of judgment call I'm making on this one now, is that I think it's stable enough with that general movement around it. And you might find yourself doing this, is just kind of pouring over certain ones. Then you've got to pick that time and say, right, I'm going to move on. There's so many gaps around it. I'm going to come back to that one later. So I'd probably make a note of the frames on this one and then come back and check it once the rest of the solves are done. But what I could do, if I was so inclined, is I could now go, all right, let's check the shoulder around that. Pick the two shoulder markers. And let's start filling some of those gaps in. quite noisy here, but I think everything's about right. Let's just fill the gaps and see. Now there's a definite wobble there, and I can see it on the graph. There's a spike. And we talked about cliffs last week. So there seems to be a jump in that marker. So I can fix that. I can select a time frame there like that covers it. And I'm going to cut the keys of the primary marker and fill it using a rigid selection, which is, see, it pops. Now I'm thinking it's probably mislabeled there. Yeah, it jumps. Actually, it jumps to that position and then returns. So I'm going to undo that fill and see what happens there. Now that's what we call a mislabel, which is a good point now to talk about labeling with everyone. So at this point in time, this marker here, instead of it being the shoulder marker, you'll see it jump. Look, from right front shoulder there on that one frame, it jumps to being the, it's still called the right front shoulder, but it's not. It's the upper arm marker. So it's jumped. Now, because that's one frame, there's a number of ways we can deal with that. We can relabel it, or we could just cut the keys because it's one frame. So actually on this one, I'm just going to cut the keys. I'm going to mark an in point and an out point at exactly the same frame, and then press the E key to cut the keys. You see that graph has flattened out now. It's not seeing that jump in position. So when the marker comes back, it's where it should be. If I undo that and show you the other method, we could do it. Now, if you look here before the jump, one keyframe before the jump, we look at what that marker is. It's the right upper arm. And then jumps, and it's the right front shoulder. So what we'll do now is we'll relabel that as the right one. So again, important to select the frame, one frame, mark it in point and out point. And now I'm going to go to my labeling panel and making sure that I've got backwards and forwards and ranges selected. If I'd had cliff, it would cause us problems. Ranges, so it'll only relabel this marker in that time frame that I've got selected, which is one frame. So what we're going to do now is we know that the moment is the right front shoulder, but it should be the right upper arm. So all I do is select the marker in the viewport that I want to relabel, and then come over to the labeling panel and click on the name that I think it should be, the right upper arm. So now what you'll see is that key has jumped. So I can look at my right front shoulder marker again, and that keyframe's gone. The jump keyframe has been taken from that container for the right front shoulder and been put into the right upper arm data container, or label as we call them. So now if I do a rigid body fill, I shouldn't get that drift in it. So let's try that. So let's select the other markers, the back front shoulder and the two back ones. And I'll scrub back to where that gap is. There, see them all missing. Hit W. And now it works. But I've noticed another thing. There's this pink marker has appeared, number 843, arbitrary name. It's unlabeled, but if you watch, I'm just keeping my eye on where things are. Look, that is the back shoulder marker. And then all of a sudden, an unlabeled marker pops into existence. So let's just select it and see what's on the graph. So we can see keys for that unlabeled marker. And I'm hedging my bets that that's the right back shoulder. So I'm going to select a range of frames there for that marker to cover all of its keys. And I'm going to tell the labeler that it's the right back shoulder. And now it makes sense. You see that unlabeled marker was actually the right back shoulder. And all I've done is told the labeler what it is. We've still got some gaps around it, but at least we have a marker that's in the right position. So we can now go back to fixing our data with our rigid fills. So if we go back before that time frame, yeah, Philip, it is. If you notice that a labeling error or something is affecting your rigid body fills, then yes, you've got to go and fix that error before you can do your rigid body fills. This is what I'm talking about, where we're investigating and finding these instances of these other errors happening. We have to fix those before we can go back and do our rigid body fill. So again, I've just done some labeling on that. So now what I'll do is I'll go back before that trouble started, select the other markers again that are in that rigid body selection, which is here for the shoulders. Where is it? Where do I say the shoulders? They're in there somewhere. I'm just being blind to seeing them. There we go, the shoulders. So we select the two shoulders and the two back markers for that rigid body, which is what I've done. I've gone back to that now. So it's almost like I'm fixing that rigid body again. So I've got that and I can hit the Q key and now you can see those frames. So I'm just going to scrub through and see that it pops back, hit W. And then I can hit Q again and it's found another gap, W, Q, W. And then there's another one there, W. And there we are. We've now got that shoulder back. It's a bit noisy, but we could potentially filter that later. But at least we've got rid of the confusion on quite a tricky gap there by using a combination of techniques. We've gone around, we've investigated that there was a jump in the labeler, so I relabeled it properly for just one frame, and it's those one frame blips that will cause the problems. And the reason I noticed that was when I did the fill, I noticed it drift in its position and jump about, and I used the cliffs on the graph to investigate that as well. So it's important that you're using a combination of the tools to fix things. Now, this is probably, like I said, probably the most complicated eventuality that you're going to come across is where there's labeling errors and there's gaps all in conjunction together. And it usually happens in these kind of instances where lots of markers have gone missing and the labeling function in the software has basically lost the ability to track it. There's too much confusion for the algorithm to work properly, and we have to go in and just tweak those frames and fix those errors for it to work. But by fixing that rigid relationship, i.e. there's no jumping about in positions, they're where that they are expected to be, the rigid body fills work properly again. So now effectively I can go in. Now, one of the things we could do is I'm looking at this marker in particular, the back shoulder. It's wobbling about. So let's have a look at the graph for that. So if I look there, look, there's a wobble. It's jumping about and it's probably going to cause a problem on the shoulder. Now, I can see, because it's got no nodules on it, this is a tracked marker. This is not a fill that I've done causing the noise. It does just before it and just after it. But during it, there's a jump in position. So how do I fix that wobble? Again, we can use the special keyboard shortcut that we've got that cuts the keys on the primary marker and fills them with the selection. But I have to select some time first. So I'm going to select the time. I can see the time there that those keyframes are wobbling. So I'm just going to draw a marquee on the graph to select that time frame to smooth that graph out. And the one that's wobbling is my primary. So I'm going to hit the Y key. And fix it. It's still not perfect, but there's less noise on it. Yeah, it cut the keys and it filled it. This is probably as good as we're going to get when we've got this much confusion in the markers. And again, a judgment call is made by you. Now, the reason we make that judgment call is all based on the skeleton. So if I select the time range here that covers that area, I'm going to go up to the solving, drop the button down and solving ranges. So it's only going to solve the skeleton in this time range that I've selected, which will make it quick, basically. It'll be very quick, and I can check to see what that shoulder looks like. Okay, there's a bit more time where it's wobbling around that. So let's zoom out on our graph. and select a bigger time range and solving ranges again. Now I'm just going to scrub through time, and now we can see, look, that shoulder is not wobbling about anymore. We fixed it as far as I'm concerned. There's a little jitter in the markers, but it's kind of averaging out. There's still some other areas around it, but this way I can investigate rather than clicking the solving button. I could have done that and it would have solved the whole take. Just to save some time, I selected a nice range of time which is either side of that gap and solved the bones for that range using the drop down button. And I've investigated it, and I'm pretty happy with that. There's still some other gaps that are going to need fixing. But in that particularly tricky section where the arms are crossed, we now have a fairly solid solve for our shoulder. There's another few things that I could do. And if you look there, I'm looking at this elbow marker in particularly. There's a gap. And as that disappears, there's some errors in the arm again. So we would want to check that solve after fixing that gap, or I can do it now. You can quickly jump in and go, right, I know the rigid body's in that. It's the upper arm marker and the other elbow marker. And I know the gap is there. So I'm going to hit the W key. And I can see that I filled that gap on the elbow marker. And it's come back. And if I click solving, I'm going to do the whole range now, just to kind of see where we're at. Take a little bit longer. Just finishing now, any minute. Okay, and now we can scrub in that timeline and see. And look, the body's nice and sturdy. It's not jittering about anymore. So as we clean those markers, it stabilizes the solve. And the more we fix, the more stable the solve is, because in my notes and thing I've said, we have a globally optimized solver. It looks at the whole picture. It doesn't look at just one area. It gets the stability for across the whole skeleton. So the more we fix across the whole skeleton, the more stable our solve becomes. And this is what we do. And we keep looking and fixing those instabilities and those problems. Yeah. And making sure we have that. And again, I'm on this gap now. I'm jumping about, but this is through experience. I can see there's a gap on the upper arm there, but I've got the 3 markers selected for it. So why not fill it? I could rotate the selection until that marker is the primary one, so I can see the gap. Yeah, I can see where that gap is, and I can either select the time, I could either move back and hit Q to find the time, or even without any time selected, as long as the time slide is over the gap, I can hit the W key and fill it. There's a little bit of a jitter there, so let's investigate that. And it's because it's before and after a gap. We've got a little bit of jitter just in this bit there. So I'm going to do the same thing again, select the time range, which kind of will smooth that gap out, and hit the Y key. And that jitter is minimized now. And I can solve the solving again. I can kind of do the whole take, or I can just zoom out, get a nice selection of time either side of that, and set solving ranges, and check that arm. Now, as it comes in, we've got a much more solid, kind of stable solve there. Still not perfect, but again, it's much better than it was. And I'm happy with that.